We are going to get started. Hopefully you have corrected the quizzes. Those are optional, but they're a very good idea for your grades and to kind of reacquaint you with where we're picking up. I hope you've had a good 2 weeks off and that it wasn't too boring for you since so much is closed down. Well, we're going to get going right now with reviewing and then talking about German nationalism. So if you remember in chapter 24 where we had left off, we were talking about French nationalism, Italian nationalism, and Italy actually became a nation state, and we were about to get into German nationalism and the building of Germany as a nation when we had to take our break. So I thought we would review real quickly with taking a look at the slides, and I've added a lot to them. I'm going to do some reading to you, and hopefully we can finish up with Otto von Bismarck and his role in German unification today. All right, well, let's go back and take a quick look at this slide. This ought to remind you, of course, of revolutionary France. And in this video, we're talking about the French Revolution of 1848. So in 1848, the French were revolting, it seems like for many, many times. Of course, we've had the main French Revolution in 1789. We've had the 1830 revolution that put Louis Philippe on the throne in replacement of the French autocrat Charles X. And then we ended up in 1848 with another revolution that unseats Louis Philippe because he has grown according to the French radicals to be passé. His idea of a constitution is not enough. And so the more radicals that are in France lead a revolution in 1848. But we talked about what are they going to get in a replacement of Louis Philippe. If Louis Philippe was a moderate who, at least, even though he claimed to be king of the French people, did embrace the constitutional charter with limited reforms for the people, what is it that they wanted? And so we talked about the fact that the socialists were not strong enough. You can go back and review your notes. The liberals not content enough. There was conservatives not organized enough. And so what comes about? Well, after the failed revolution of 1848, there's an election, and that election brings out, of course, the grandnephew of Napoleon, Louis Bonaparte. Okay, Louis Napoleon, who we will later call Napoleon III. So this image should remind you of who was in the coalition that supported Louis Napoleon. And remember, we talked about this in class. The statue, of course, is of Napoleon Bonaparte. The banners in the back call for the election of Louis Napoleon. And the people in the front, they are those who would want us to be reminded of the greatness of Napoleon, and mostly the days of Napoleon, right? This idea that when Napoleon Bonaparte was in charge of France, we had a truly powerful nation, a truly wonderful nation. We were headed in the right direction. Of course, there had been, by 1848, a generation that had passed. And now the French people are looking back with fondness upon Napoleon Bonaparte's reign, at least enough of them are, to where he kind of has this rehabbing of his reputation. And the French people vote in Louis Napoleon. What is Louis Napoleon going to be? Well, we talked about the fact that Louis Napoleon would serve as really a strong man. He came in with a lot of promises. Many of these promises were based on his own good, his own personal debt relief. He took away the rights of the very people that voted for him in the French election and then restored them. Louis Napoleon, this is where we left France, he would be powerful enough to rule France, but his popularity would decline over the many years of rule. Very popular at first in 1848. By the time we finish today's lecture, it's actually going to be 1871, and we're going to be saying goodbye to Louis Napoleon in a pretty humiliating end for who would call himself the Emperor of France. Remember, he slowly had himself called hereditary emperor, emperor for life. And so this is not some kind of democratic ruler. This is instead a strong man who rules because he believes that he's bringing good to the people and he's convinced the people of that idea. So moving on, we're going to go into our discussion here of Europe real quickly. So if we want to take a look at where we are, we have a solidified France, right? We have a solidified France with Louis Napoleon as leader. We have a reformed, not revolutionary, United Kingdom or Britain, in which we have the Tories and Whigs battling each other, but in that giving power to the people, at least to some degree. And we're about to review the unification of Italy. And so this helps us understand the Europe that is shaping up. So let me go on and review just a bit about the unification of Italy. So remember that von Metternich had called Italy a geographical expression, right? He said this in a mocking tone, the idea that, well, Italy's not really even a thing. Italy's not even a nation state. It's just something that we use to call this collection of states that are really piecemeal. But the Italians did long for a unity. And especially in the face of the competing powers, the Holy Alliances, the Concert of Europe, as we called it after 1815, Italy did have a desire within for unity. So who are the people that were possible leaders in the battle for Italian unity? Let's look at the names. First of all, if you remember, Giuseppe Mazzini. Now, Mazzini was the democratic idealist. Mazzini had hoped, and we read a passage from him, if you remember in the text, that Italy could be a democratic republic and that they could vote for a president. That was not going to work out. Italy needed a much stronger hand to come together, and Mazzini himself was done away with by opposing forces. And so Giuseppe Mazzini called for Italian nationalism under a democratic leadership. If you remember, there was also the idea that maybe Italy could be ruled by a pope, that the Pope himself could unite various Italian city-states, republics, kingdoms, and that it could be ruled as a Catholic force. But the Pope saw and recognized what it was like to deal with competing political forces. He had had to flee Rome just a few years before. And if you remember, the Pope himself, the new Pope, had rejected liberalism, modernism, and said, this is not what we do. And so that meant that the idea of unity underneath a Pope was not going to work out. So what could we look to? Well, if you were in northern Italy, your hope was in this man, Camillo Cavour. Now, Cavour was not a king. We want to remember that Cavour works with this fellow right here, Victor Emmanuel, who is the king of an area in the northern part of Italy known as Piedmont. This kingdom of Piedmont was eventually put together with the kingdom of Sardinia. And that made Italy's most prosperous, most modern, and economically strong area called the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont. Cavour's idea was that he could unite the northern Italian powers, those outside of Sardinia-Piedmont, and that with his ideas about modern government, about economic strength and growth, the institution of rail, a modern, more liberal policy, because you would consider Cavour to be a bit of a liberal, a classical liberal. He believed that Sardinia and Piedmont could unite northern Italy. What he wasn't really counting on was the idea that southern Italy would also want to be united. And then you'll remember Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi was the leader of the Southern Italian movement, and it was largely soft socialism. Garibaldi had a lot of poor people, a lot of frustrated people, a lot of working people, a lot of socialists, or at least people who had been indoctrinated by socialism. And their idea was that they wanted rights but they also wanted nationalism. When you look at each of the figures here, it's important to note that they all represent Italian nationalist heroes. Yes, they're liberals, or they're socialists, or they're classical Democrats, or they are even kings. But their hope is that Italy can be united ultimately. Now, remember, we talked about how Cavour really hadn't planned for the Southern Italians to be a part of this. But as Garibaldi made his way up from the south and decided to come into the Papal States and start revolution and start to encourage overthrowing of the various republics and leadership, Cavour figured he would rather call for an Italian unity of the whole and peace. And so Victor Emmanuel makes his famous ride to meet Garibaldi. Right, as Garibaldi comes up from the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, King Victor Emmanuel comes southward from the Kingdom of Sardinia Piedmont to meet up with Garibaldi and head off the possibility of a revolution. So looking at this map, you see the Kingdom of Sardinia Piedmont united here, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. This is what Garibaldi had a lot of influence over, the Papal States right here, right? And then these areas that had been given to the Austrians, and that stung a lot of Italians still. So while Camillo Cavour and Victor Emmanuel had hoped to unite these areas and perhaps even to gain back some territory, Garibaldi threw a wrench in those plans. And so what we're going to have is the meeting of Victor Emmanuel and Garibaldi. This painting, again, is in your text. And when you look at this painting, I want you to remember the story of Italian unification, specifically under Garibaldi and Emmanuel, where socialism meets nationalism, and nationalism wins out, because Garibaldi has to give up his socialist dreams and the socialist demands of his people in order for Italy to be united. They believe, oh, we're going to get something out of this. We'll become an Italian nation state, and then we'll get some kind of the promises that we believe a socialist state can bring about. But if Garibaldi's followers wanted that, they were going to be disappointed. What they did get was united Italy in 1870. And so we'll leave that there with France and Italy. Let's talk about the Germans. All right. So what about the unification of Germany? We're going to talk about one man today in most of our time, and that is Otto von Bismarck. But I want to talk about going back in history, the problem with why there isn't a Germany to begin with. Now, remember, we've been talking about Prussia and the Prussian kingdom. So here is the majority right here of the Prussian kingdom, right? And then we have this area that you should know as the Sentinel on the Rhine, the area that the Prussians had been given to help to control the French. After the end of the French Revolution, after the Battle of Waterloo, Prussia had been established, remember, as a Sentinel on the Rhine, but it is a divided area. What Germany is made up of is various kingdoms, principalities, and eventually what was formed was called the German Confederation. And the German Confederation was a mixture of many, many, many different states who had some relation to the German ethnicity, to Germanic languages, but there wasn't a whole lot of unity to this German Confederation. Some things, though, did begin to emerge to unify these German, these areas that would become modern-day Germany. So let's first talk about two ideas that you see in these thought bubbles here, okay? Two ideas had come out of history about what to actually do with all of this. You know, how do we take this area and make it into a modern nation state? And what should that look like? Well, the first suggestion included in the idea of a modern Germany, if you will, or a united political entity of the Germanic peoples, it included Austria. So when you talked about a future empire of the Germans and you included in that Austria, that was known as Großdeutsch. The idea that Germany could be, or a Germanic people group, a Germanic empire, could be done in a very, very big way. Gross, right? Gross, large. The Großdeutsch is the idea of a modern united Germanic people, including the Austrians. A lot of people did not want to see that. They didn't like the idea of there being Austria. They didn't believe that the Austrians should be involved in the putting together of the German state, and they wanted to put together a German state that excluded the Austrians. And this is called Kleindeutsch, a smaller German area. This view of Kleindeutsch says do away with the Austrians. They have their own empire, their own ways of doing things, and they have their own problems. Let's not forget their problems with varying ethnicities and also with the Hungarians who have now given them a challenge. And so Kleindeutsch was a smaller vision for how Germany could be united. So when we talk about this issue, we have to understand that out of the entire German Confederation, the Prussians were the emerging leaders. The Prussians had Europe's strongest army. The Prussians were a growing world power, although they did not have a seat at the table as much of as a modern nation state. They had been significant in assisting the English at Waterloo. And so the Prussians had kind of made a name for themselves, and they were certainly an upstart when you thought about the Confederation of the Rhine, and an upstart that Austria really resented. And the idea that Austria was this old, dying empire and that the Prussians represented the newer, more modern take on Europe was very, very offensive to Austria and to Emperor Joseph. But there is this problem that's taking place between the Prussians and the Austrians, and that's going to be exacerbated by some of the things that we're going to talk about now. First of all, some territorial disputes with the Danes. So let's keep going, and we're going to keep talking about this unification and how it might be accomplished. All right, if you want to talk about the way that Germany eventually unites, let's think of it in three phases. First of all, what do you have to do to rouse Prussian nationalism? How is it that you can get the Prussians themselves to stop thinking about other concerns they have? How can you get them to favor, if you will, Prussian nationalism and the prosperity of a united Prussia, even over their own rights, specifically the rights that the classical liberals were pushing for? Because within Prussia, like everywhere else, you have a sector of conservatives, you have a sector of classical liberals, you have a sector of socialists. And so how do you get the nationalist impulse in Prussia to take the top spot amongst those other concerns? Second, how can the Prussians appeal to the other areas of North Germany and thus unite the northern German people that are not Prussian into Prussia itself? How can Prussia flex its muscle and get that done? And then a third question, even if you get the northern republics to join with Prussia, how do you get South Germany, which is a little bit like Italy, much more poor compared to the northern region, much more agrarian compared to the northern region, and in Germany's case, far more Catholic, go way back to the Reformation. And remember when we had established, okay, all leaders are going to get to choose whether they're Protestant or whether they're Catholic, and those rulers, they will determine the faith in the regions. Many of the regions of the South, although not all, were strongly Catholic. And so they do not have much in common with the Prussian mentality about modernism, about Protestantism, about building a war machine, about modern day capitalist impulses, about industrialism. Rural, Southern, Catholic, agrarian Germany. How do you get them to unite with the Prussians and form the country that certain people want? And who wants it, by the way? Well, one of the people who want this is a man named Otto von Bismarck. We're going to do a lot of talking about Otto von Bismarck in the next few minutes. I want you to have a good understanding of who he is, what he did, and why we really talk about Otto von Bismarck as the architect of German unity more than the king of Germany, which seems odd. So let's get into Otto von Bismarck and talk about him a little bit. Probably the most famous speech. I don't know how to move my little face from down here. Let me see if I can get this. There we go. All right. Probably the most famous of Otto von Bismarck's speeches you might have heard before. You might have heard it in your world history class. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided, but by blood and iron, or by iron and blood, as this slide puts it. This is a famous, famous quote by Bismarck. But how do we put this quote into context? We can say, oh, blood and iron, that's Bismarck. What did he mean? And who was he speaking to when he made this statement? Just take a look at what he's kind of trashing, right? What are the things that don't matter to Bismarck in this quote? Speeches and majority decisions. They don't decide the questions of the day. And so you can tell that there's a certain group that he was kind of casting some aspersions on their theories as to what could make Germany into a great and united nation. Let's sit back and talk about Otto von Bismarck just a little bit. I'm going to actually read to you a very small passage from a book on Otto von Bismarck. This is one of the books, if I can get this Kindle to turn on. This is one of the books that we talked about in class. And I actually downloaded this book on my husband's Kindle for no cost. So if you have a Kindle, I think you might have to have Amazon Prime, I'm not really sure. You can simply go to the Amazon Prime store or to the Kindle store, look for Otto von Bismarck, Charles River Editors, and you will find this book for free. And so I'm going to read to you just a little bit that I hope gives you a little bit of a flavor of where Otto von Bismarck came from, because we're going to look at him at his most successful points and at his most successful political points. We're not really going to pick up with Otto von Bismarck as a politician until he's about 47 years old. But I'm interested a little bit in what he's like and how he came to power. To understand this, you've got to go back to the Junker nobility that we talked about way, way back many, many chapters ago, and understanding that they were a special kind of nobility, not like the nobility of France, not like the nobility of England, but their own special Prussian land-owning nobility. This is the family that Otto von Bismarck came from. And so I just want to read you just a little bit about Otto von Bismarck, and then we'll pick back up with his life when he turns about 47, about the time that Prussia has a failed socialist revolution of 1848. Okay, so let's take a quick listen to a short part about Otto von Bismarck's life. Otto von Bismarck was born to Ferdinand von Bismarck Schonhausen and his wife Wilhelmine Mencken in 1815 in Prussia. Otto Flans says his heritage was both bourgeois and aristocratic, the son of fifth-generation nobility on his father's side and civil service on his mother's. Bismarck's father was known as kind and well-intentioned, but he was considered the least talented of his brothers and more interested in social matters and entertainment than business or farming, his destined occupation. Though Bismarck did not struggle with loving his father, he did struggle with respecting him, as evidenced in a letter written to his fiancée years after his father's death. I really loved my father. When not with him, I felt remorse concerning my conduct toward him, and I made resolutions that I was unable to keep for the most part. How often did I repay his truly boundless, unselfish, good-natured tenderness for me with coldness and bad grace. Even more frequently, I made a pretense of loving him, not wanting to violate my own code of propriety, when inwardly I felt hard and unloving because of his apparent weakness. I was not in a position to pass judgment on those apparent weaknesses, which annoyed me only when coupled with gaucherie. And yet, I cannot deny that I really loved him in my heart. I wanted to show you how much it oppresses me when I think about it. The Hunker nobility to which Bismarck belonged was a service nobility, with allegiance to the Prussian king. Unlike their noble counterparts in nearby nations, Prussian nobles knew little of individual power, extreme riches. Instead, the Junkers were nearer to the soil, often milking their own cows and selling their wool themselves at the nearest market, sometimes distinguished from the more prosperous peasant farmers only by their historic names. Bismarck's father led a relatively simple life and harbored no delusions about a change in family status. His management of the family estate proved so ineffectual that he was forced to give up Schönhausen and move to Niehof, a smaller estate, soon after Bismarck was born. His mother, on the other hand, was far stricter with her son and ensured her children would be more highly educated than was typical of the rural Junker nobility. Bismarck attended the Plamen boarding school from the age of 6. Here, and later at the gymnasium in Berlin, he would receive a strong classical education. He neither excelled or appreciated his education and resented his mother, even claiming to have hated her. Wilhelmine Mencken had exposure to the royal court through her philosopher father until she was 12. After his early death, Wilhelmine was reduced in her social status and married the 35-year-old Ferdinand at the age of 17. Wilhelmine suffered not only from an unhappy marriage, but disappointment in her attempts to live vicariously through her sons, who lacked her intellect or drive, at least as far as education was concerned. Her letter to Bismarck's older brother reveals the ire with which her children were met when they disappointed her. I imagined that my greatest fortune would be have a grown son who, educated under my very eyes, would agree with me, but as a man would be called to penetrate deeper into the world of intellect than I as a woman could do. I rejoiced in the thought of the intellectual exchange, the mutual exchange for mental and spiritual engagement, and the satisfying feeling to have such pleasures with a person who would be, through the bonds of nature, dearest to my heart, and who still more, through the kinship of spirit, would draw closer than ever to me. The time for these hopes to be fulfilled has arrived, but they've disappeared, unfortunately, I must confess, forever. Bismarck's memories of the Plamen School were negative. The teachers, he claimed, were demagogic and abusive, both waking and disciplining the children with rapier blows. Later, Bismarck's education at the gymnasium further embittered him against his mother, since he preferred the farming life the country afforded. There, he learned English and French, German literature, and music, as well as math and science. He appreciated many things he learned, but if Flans is correct, his education provided him with quotations which later adorned his speech and writing, but it did not change the way that he looked at life. Attending university in Hanover, Bismarck first proclaimed himself a liberal, but grew more nationalistic over his years of exposure to, quote, ill-bred students from the middle class, end quote, whom he despised. He spent more time making friends and drinking than studying and came home after just 1 year. One of his many biographers describes a young college student who was interested in creating an image, quote, striding around Göttingen in unconventional clothes, accompanied by a large mastiff dog. Bismarck had accrued debt in just a few months. As he stated in a letter to his friend, his credit continued to allow him to live in a slovenly way. His lifestyle, he said, had caused him to look ill, which he was sure the old man would, of course, ascribe when he went home for Christmas to a lack of means of subsistence. And then he would make a scene and say to him that he would rather be a Muslim than suffer hunger any longer, and that would solve the problem. The contempt he had for his father, at least when out of his presence, is revealed in ugly fashion. At the University of Berlin, his academics improved slightly when he studied law, but he spent most of his time on history and German and English literature. So it tells you just a little bit about Otto von Bismarck's life growing up as the son of an agricultural noble despising his father for being someone of lower education, but then kind of despising his mother for making him go to school. Bismarck always was more concentrated on image and reputation and power than he really was on philosophy. And we get a special word called realpolitik when we talk about Otto von Bismarck. What we talk about is that he is a pragmatic leader. He does what he thinks is going to get him to the goal that he wants. And the goal that Otto von Bismarck wants is German unification. Otto von Bismarck wants to unify Germany. And what is it going to take to do that? That goes back to our questions. How do you rouse Prussian nationalism? How do you unite the Northern Germans? And then how do you unite the Southern Germans? And so there's a lot of debate historically about Otto von Bismarck, but what a lot of people would say is, rather than von Bismarck having some kind of long-standing hatred against the Austrians or the Danes or the French, what Otto von Bismarck really wanted was a united Germany. And if he had to fight the Danes, the Austrians, or the French, or he had to befriend any of those groups, or the Russians or the English, to get that done, that is indeed what he would do. Otto von Bismarck's desire is for German unity and a modern German nation state. To get that done, Otto von Bismarck was going to have to convince the king of Germany that he needed to take power back from the people. Now, let's understand something, okay? When Bismarck comes into the power to sway the king and to have the king's ear, which he does through becoming part of the Prussian legislature, working his way up into government, becoming the king's envoy, and then being sent to various lands as a foreign ambassador or diplomat, he is facing a very divided Germany, or I should say Prussia. Prussia has, like we said, some socialism, but more, they're dealing with the demands of classical liberals. And this is why Bismarck says what he says. He says, the decisions that we make aren't going to be made by majority decisions, in other words, voting rights, or speeches, reason, engagement, but by blood and iron. He's calling for a nationalistic response from the Germans. And he tries to get the king to believe this and say to the king, don't give up your rights to the classical liberals. They want you to rule with a constitution. But in ruling with a constitution, you must cede power. And that's what we don't want to give away. So Bismarck spends a lot of time trying to convince the king that parliaments are what he calls a necessary evil. I'm going to pick up with that just for a second here and listen again as I read just a little bit out of this book on Bismarck. At 47, Bismarck was finally in a position to directly influence the king, shaping the land into a new and unified Germany and guiding her through wars and uncertain times over the next 27 years. His belief that parliaments were a necessary evil did not mean he looked forward to working with them or that he respected their right to exist. In fact, Bismarck's opening words on becoming chief minister would be his most famous, discounting the power of words and calling instead on his trust in Blut and Uneisen. On September 30th, only a week after returning to Berlin, he delivered the now famous Blood and Iron speech to the Budget Commission of Parliament. There are members of the National Association of this association that have achieved a reputation owing to the justice of their demands. Highly esteemed members who have stated that all standing armies are superfluous. Yes, if only a public assembly had this view. Would not a government have to reject this? There was talk about the sobriety of the Prussian people. Yes, the great independence of the individual makes it difficult in Prussia to govern with the Constitution. In France, things are different. There, this individual independence is lacking. A constitutional crisis would not be disgraceful, but honorable instead. Furthermore, we are perhaps too well educated to support a constitution. We are too critical. The ability to assess government measures and records of the public assembly is too common. In the country, there are a lot of Catiline characters who have a great interest in upheavals. This may sound paradoxical, but everything proves how hard constitutional life is in Prussia. Furthermore, one is too sensitive about the government's mistakes, as if it were enough to say this and that cabinet minister made mistakes, as if one wasn't adversely affected oneself. Public opinion changes. The press is not public opinion. One knows how the press is written. Members of Parliament have a higher duty to lead opinion and to stand above it. We are too hot-blooded. We have a preference for putting on armor that is too big for our small body, and now we're actually supposed to utilize it? Germany is not looking to Prussian liberalism, but to Prussian power. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden may indulge liberalism, and for that reason, no one will assign them Prussia's role. Prussia has to coalesce and concentrate its power for the opportune moment, which has already been missed several times. Prussia's borders, according to the Vienna Treaty, are not favorable for a healthy, vital state. And it is not by speeches and majority resolutions that the great questions of the time are decided. That was the big mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. So here, Bismarck gets up 2 weeks into basically having this job where he has a lot of influence over the king and makes this speech. There was a complete and utter uproar on the floor, and people, the classical liberals, of course, were howling at the idea that Bismarck would discount voting rights, people's rights, constitutions, that he would dare do this. What is Bismarck representing here? Is he representing conservatism? In other words, just sheer adherence to the old rules of royalty? Because he does want a king with great power? Or does he represent a new conservatism? That is the question that's asked in the DBQ that I handed out and that we're going to be covering in a separate video this week as you work through it. So we want to ask ourselves, what is Bismarck going to do next? He is going to fight the king for his entire career. The king, the first king that he works with, and the second king will always be a little bit nervous about what Bismarck is going to do. King Wilhelm, the king who is on the throne at the time that Bismarck makes the speech, completely freaks out about what Bismarck has done. And the king listens to his wife, who says, you know what's going to happen if you allow Bismarck to speak for you? You're going to be dead, because the people are going to chop your head off just like they did the kings of old. So this is recorded. Wilhelm cries, I can perfectly see where all this will end. He's talking to Bismarck. Over there, in front of the opera house, under my windows, they will cut off your head and mine a little while afterward. So the king was very worried that Bismarck was going to land him underneath the sword. That didn't happen. This king, of course, did become mentally ill and had to resign his position, died, and new king, King William I, is who Bismarck would spend most of his time with. But the kings survived, and the kings of Germany even outlived Bismarck. But that's not going to be true for a very long time. So let's go back to the first question. What will rouse Prussian nationalism? How do you get the Prussian people thinking about, right, Prussia as the leader? You can hear what Bismarck says here. Prussia's the one. Other countries get to fool around and get to play around with great ideas, but Prussia's the leader. Prussia's the one with the armor on. Prussia's the one that's got to lead things. They don't have time to mess around with majority speeches and decisions. They've got to carry the German nation state forward. So let's come up with a group that we can focus on. Well, back in the map, if you want to go back a couple of slides later, back in the map with the territories in the German Confederation, way up north, there are two areas that were in the German Confederation, but they had always been considered to be the property of the Danes. And now Denmark had a new king, and that king decided that for once and for all, he was going to go in and he was going to actually take Schleswig-Holstein, which is the hyphenated area for these two land regions and say these are really properly belonging to the Danes. They should have a Danish flag. And we know that they've been kind of messing around in the German Confederation, but now we're going to say that these really belong to us. And so who does it affect? Well, all right, here's Schleswig, and then they're in the blue. And then here is Holstein, of course, Prussia down here, and Denmark right here on the Jutland Peninsula. Well, let's talk about this for a second. These areas were in the German Confederation, and to a degree, the Prussians had always had a lot of influence in the area of Schleswig, whereas the Austrians had influence in the area of Holstein. Now, all of these people are within the German Confederation. Very important to note something here. While Austria was considered to be the most powerful part of the German Confederation, even above Prussia, because they were the oldest power and they were one of the very big world powers sitting down at the Congress of Vienna, etc., the Austrians had been locked out of something called the Zollverein. It's called the Zollverein. Let me see if I can write this for you because I forgot to include it in the slide here. Let's see if I can do this. Z-O-L-L-V-E-R. Oh, that's supposed to be an E. E-I-N. All right, the Zollverein. The Zollverein was a customs association. And what it did was allow goods to be freely traded if you belonged to this customs union. And what the Prussians had been successful at doing was involving a lot of members of the German Confederation in the Zollverein, giving them thus free trade and advancement within that customs organization, but they had excluded the Austrians. That meant that the Austrians were locked out of the economic benefits, even those that were being churned still as a result of the Industrial Revolution and its effects. So already Prussia had kind of been edging out its big brother, and Bismarck loved this. Bismarck could not stand the Austrians thinking they were better than the Germans traditionally. And he did things like he would go into the Confederation at Frankfurt for the meetings, and the Austrians had always taken precedence. When an Austrian was standing, no one was allowed to sit in their presence from one of the other confederated areas. When you were in the presence of an Austrian diplomat in Frankfurt, you had to keep on your coat because it was a symbol of recognition that, oh, well, the Austrians are here and they're clearly our big brother and they're clearly the best of us. You didn't smoke, certainly, in front of an Austrian diplomat unless they were smoking. Well, Bismarck personally broke all those rules, sitting down in their presence, taking off his jacket, smoking cigars. He wanted to let the Austrians know from the very beginning, we don't think that you're all that. Prussia, we think, is up and coming, and you're a power that's being eclipsed by our might. Nonetheless, in 1864, these two groups of people, the Prussians and the Austrians, they are going to go after the Danes. Because in 1864, the Danes decide that they're going to make a move and they're going to take Schleswig-Holstein and they're going to incorporate it into Denmark. Prussia and Austria say that isn't going to happen, and they immediately go to war. They cross what's called the Eider, and they go into war in 1864 against the Danes, and they win. But the truth is that most people knew that Prussia was joining up with Austria really only to get what they wanted. And hold on one second, let me erase this here. Sorry, guys. What Bismarck specifically wanted, can I go back? All right, I'm going to cut this off and restart with another video.